Thomas Wei had been working in the imperial palace's culinary services for 6 months. Long enough to understand the basic protocols, but not long enough to navigate the more complex cultural nuances of Tharvari formal service. The annual treaty celebration banquet was his first assignment to the head table rotation. Prestigious duty for someone with his limited experience, probably because he developed a reputation for reliable competence rather than any particular skill. The banquet was proceeding through elaborate courses, each presented with ceremony that combined Tharvari and human diplomatic traditions. Everything choreographed, everything weighted with political significance, everything performed with careful attention to protocol. Thomas was in the kitchen, preparing the next course for the head table when he noticed the problem. The ceremonial platter meant for the Empress's portion had been damaged. One of the other servers had dropped it during the previous course transition. The damage wasn't severe, but the platter was no longer suitable for formal presentation. The head server was scrambling to find a replacement. All the other ceremonial platters were either in use or didn't match the proper protocol for serving the Empress directly. They needed something immediately, the timing was carefully choreographed, and delays would be noticed. Use a standard plate, Thomas suggested, just a plain service plate without decoration. The head server stared at him like he'd suggested something obscene. We can't present food to the Empress on unmarked dishware. The protocols require. The protocols are about respect, not about fancy plates, Thomas interrupted. We're out of ceremonial options, and delaying the course will be more disrespectful than using simple dishware. Give her good food on a clean plate presented professionally. That's better than scrambling and looking incompetent. The head server, faced with no good alternatives and a timeline that was already slipping, made the decision. Fine, use a standard plate, but you're the one presenting it since this was your idea. Thomas took the Empress's portion, a beautifully prepared dish representing the fusion of human and Tharvari culinary traditions, and placed it on a plain white ceramic plate. No decorations, no imperial symbols, no ornate presentation elements. Just food on simple, clean dishware. He carried it to the head table with the same professional bearing he used for any service, approached Empress Lyra'seth tel Kavarin's position, and set the plate before her without ceremony or announcement. Just a server doing his job, presenting food to a guest. The banquet hall didn't fall silent immediately. There were hundreds of people present, multiple conversations happening, the ambient noise of a large formal dinner. But the area around the head table went quiet as people noticed what had just happened. A human server had just placed a plain, unmarked plate before the Empress. No ceremony, no announcement, no decorative elements signaling respect through elaborate presentation. Just food on simple dishware, presented as though she were any other guest rather than the absolute ruler of an interstellar empire. Empress Lyra'seth looked at the plate. For a moment she simply regarded it, her expression unreadable through the cultural differences. Then she did something that made the spreading silence become complete. She bowed her head. Not a full formal bow, just a subtle lowering of her head in a gesture Thomas's cultural training identified as profound respect or acknowledgement in Tharvari tradition. The banquet hall fell absolutely silent. Conversations died mid-sentence. Diplomats from both species stared at the head table with expressions ranging from confusion to shock. Something significant had just happened, but Thomas didn't understand what. He was frozen in his serving position, uncertain whether he just committed a catastrophic breach of protocol that the Empress was somehow acknowledging, or whether something else entirely was occurring. One of the Tharvari diplomatic officials stood abruptly. "Your Majesty, if there was some error in the service, we can immediately." "Sit down." The Empress's voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. "There was no error. This is kel'vasthen. I will honor it appropriately." She looked at Thomas directly. "What is your name?" "Thomas Wei, Your Majesty." His voice was steadier than he felt. "I'm culinary services staff. I apologize if the presentation was inappropriate. The ceremonial platter was damaged, and we were trying to maintain the timing of the service rather than cause delays." "You presented me with food on an unmarked plate," the Empress interrupted. "No ceremony, no symbols of rank or imperial house, no decorative elements that establish hierarchy or formal relationship. Just nourishment on simple dishware, offered as you would offer it to anyone. Yes, Your Majesty. I'm sorry if that violated protocol. I thought it was better than delaying the course or presenting food on damaged ceremonial pieces. In Tharvari culture, the Empress said, and her voice carried through the silent banquet hall, accepting food without ornament is kel'vasthen, declaration of equality and trust. It signals that the relationship between giver and receiver requires no proof of intentions, no performance of respect through ceremony, no ritual to validate the interaction. It's reserved for moments of profound trust or for relationships where hierarchy has been voluntarily set aside. She gestured at the plate before her. You presented me with kel'vasthen without knowing what you were offering. You gave me food as you would give it to anyone, with simple respect and professional care, but without the performance of status. That is either profound insult or profound honor, depending on whether I choose to accept it. Empress Lyra'seth picked up her utensils and began eating from the plain plate Thomas had set before her. The act was simple, ordinary, just someone eating food at a formal dinner. But in the context of the silent banquet hall, with hundreds of witnesses watching, it carried weight Thomas was only beginning to understand. I accept kel'vasthen, the Empress said between bites. I acknowledge that this human server, in presenting me with food on simple dishware without ceremony or performance of rank, has offered a relationship of equality and trust. Whether he intended that offer or not, I choose to honor it. She looked at Thomas directly. Sit with me, share this meal. If we're to have kel'vasthen, we'll observe it properly. Your Majesty, I'm serving staff. I can't. You can because I'm ordering it. Kel'vasthen requires presence, not performance. Sit. Thomas sat in the empty chair beside the Empress, acutely aware that every diplomat, official, and guest in the banquet hall was staring at them. One of the Tharvari officials leaned in to speak quietly to the Empress. Your Majesty, he couldn't have understood what he was offering. Kel'vasthen is sacred tradition, not something to be invoked accidentally by someone ignorant of its significance. That's exactly what makes his offering valuable, Lyra'seth responded, her voice still carrying to those nearby. He gave me food as he would give it to anyone, with care and respect, but without calculation about ceremony or status. That's what kel'vasthen is supposed to be, honest interaction without performance of hierarchy. She turned to Thomas. Tell me why you chose a plain plate when the ceremonial platter was damaged. Because the food was more important than the presentation. Because delaying the service or using damaged ceremonial pieces would have been disrespectful in ways that mattered more than what the food was served on. Because a simple plate presented professionally seemed better than elaborate dishware presented poorly. You prioritized substance over ceremony, function over status performance, honest service over elaborate ritual. The Empress smiled slightly. That's what kel'vasthen represents. Relationship where intentions don't require proof through ceremony, trust that doesn't need ornament to validate it. She continued eating from the plain plate, and gradually the banquet hall's conversations resumed as people processed what they'd witnessed. But the atmosphere had changed, less formal somehow, less weighted with the performance of diplomatic status. Thomas sat beside the Empress, still not entirely certain what had just happened, but understanding that the simple act of serving food on plain dishware had created something significant that he hadn't intended and didn't fully understand. You're uncomfortable, the Empress observed, being watched by everyone in this hall while sitting beside me as though we're equals. Yes, Your Majesty, this isn't. I'm not supposed to be here. I'm kitchen staff. You're here because you offered kel'vasthen and I accepted it. That makes you exactly where you're supposed to be. She set down her utensils. In Tharvari culture, we have elaborate ceremonies for everything. Every interaction between ruler and subject follows protocols designed to reinforce hierarchy and demonstrate mutual respect. It's beautiful, it's meaningful, but it also creates distance. It makes genuine connection difficult because everyone is performing their roles rather than simply being present with each other. She gestured at the plain plate. You gave me food without performance. You treated me as someone who needed to be fed well and on time, not as a symbol requiring elaborate ceremony. That simplicity, that honest service without calculation, is rare, especially in contexts like this, where everything is weighted with political significance. I was just doing my job. Exactly, and that's why it mattered. The banquet concluded without further incidents, but the consequences of the kel'vasthen moment rippled through the diplomatic community. Thomas was summoned to meetings with human diplomatic officials who were trying to understand whether he'd accidentally created a diplomatic incident or an unprecedented opportunity. Tharvari cultural experts explained that kel'vasthen was traditionally invoked only in the most intimate relationships or in moments of deliberate political significance. For an empress to accept it from a human servant was without precedent. "You changed the nature of the relationship between our species," one diplomat told Thomas during a debriefing. "By offering food without ceremony and having the empress accept it, you've signaled that human-Tharvari relations can operate on trust rather than on elaborate performance of mutual respect. That's diplomatically huge. I just served food on the only clean plate available," Thomas protested. "I wasn't making a political statement. That's what made it powerful. You weren't performing anything. You were just doing your job with simple competence and respect. That honesty, that lack of calculation, is what kel'vasthen is supposed to represent." Empress Lyra'seth requested Thomas's presence at a private audience a week after the banquet. "You've become politically significant without intending to," she told him in the informal reception room where they met. "The diplomatic community is treating your simple act of practical problem-solving as a profound statement about human-Tharvari relations. Are you comfortable with that?" "Not particularly, Your Majesty. I'm kitchen staff, not a diplomat. I don't want to be a symbol of something I don't understand." "Good, that honesty is exactly what makes you valuable." She moved to sit across from him, still maintaining appropriate physical distance, but without the formal positioning that would emphasize hierarchical difference. "I accepted kel'vasthen from you not because I thought you were making a calculated political gesture, but because your actions demonstrated something rare in my experience: simple sincerity. You saw a problem, damaged ceremonial dishware, and solved it practically without worrying about status implications. You gave me food as you would give it to anyone, with care and competence, but without performance of hierarchy. That's just basic professionalism, Your Majesty. In most contexts, yes. But in a formal banquet where everything is performance and ceremony, where every gesture carries political weight and every interaction is calculated for diplomatic effect, in that context, simple professionalism becomes revolutionary." She leaned forward slightly. "You weren't performing respect, you were embodying it. That's what kel'vasthen recognizes. What happens now? Now I'm creating a new position: cultural liaison between human and Tharvari culinary traditions. You'll work directly with my household staff to continue developing fusion cuisine that represents both species' traditions. You'll also attend formal functions where your presence serves as reminder that sometimes the most respectful approach is the simplest one. Your Majesty, I'm not qualified for diplomatic." "You're not serving in a diplomatic capacity. You're serving in the same capacity you served at the banquet, doing your job with competence and sincerity without worrying about performance of status. That's exactly the quality I need in someone working closely with my household." Years later, Thomas reflected on that banquet where he'd placed a plain plate before an empress and accidentally invoked a sacred tradition he didn't know existed. The silence that had fallen when she bowed her head. The hours of sitting beside absolute authority, sharing a meal as equals because he'd offered food without ceremony, and she'd chosen to honor that simplicity. He'd learned that in Tharvari culture, elaborate ceremony could actually create distance rather than connection. That sometimes the most respectful gesture was the simplest one, offering what someone needed with competence and care, without performance of status or calculation of political significance. The human had placed a plain plate before the alien empress. She had bowed her head in recognition of kel'vasthen, trust and equality offered without ornament. And in that moment of accepting food on simple dishware, she had demonstrated that true authority recognizes sincerity when it appears, regardless of whether it arrives through calculated ceremony or accidental simplicity. Sometimes the greatest respect is offered through the simplest gestures. Sometimes sincerity commands more recognition than the grandest rituals. Sometimes a plain plate carries more weight than the most elaborate ceremonial presentation, because it represents honest service without performance, care without calculation, respect embodied rather than merely displayed. Thomas had just been doing his job. And in doing so, he demonstrated something that elaborate diplomatic protocol had been failing to achieve: genuine relationship unadorned by performance of status. The Empress had recognized it, honored it, and transformed both their relationship and the broader diplomatic context through the simple act of accepting food offered without ceremony. The plate was plain. The gesture was simple. The recognition was profound.